thank you all for being here and for the invitation to talk to you about technicians and the development of the profession within the UK. Normally, of course, I've given academic lectures, and my specialist subject was always fluid mechanics and rather complicated mathematics. But that's not what I'm going to do today. I'm going to talk to you about another passion, so you don't have to run away. It's very good to see people in the front row. This never happened to me as a lecturer in a university. But what I want to talk about is the technicians who make science possible for those of us who class ourselves as research scientists. They work in many ways, and I want to use my own career as an example to illustrate, first of all, what they've done to help me, to make my career possible, and secondly, to illustrate how recognizing them is, first of all, easy for an individual, but not so easy for the system. And there's a development in process in the UK led by the Science Council, which is trying to recognize more the technical input we receive as research scientists from our technical staff. So that's important. So that's what I'm going to try and do. I want to use my own career because I've been an experimental scientist. Some might say I stopped some time ago, but I like to think I'm still active. And for 50 years, therefore, in one way or another, technical staff have made possible the science I've performed. I began my life in the University of Exeter as a PhD student and undergraduate student in physics. And I realized then that technicians were vital. And other people have recognized how important they are to science. But unfortunately, in the modern way, they've tried to summarize what a technician is in a nice, simple sentence. And these are some of the phrases that have been used to try and characterize what technical input is, what technicians are. In my view, this barely does justice to it. The breadth of the input, the expertise, most especially the experience of people, is very important to the educational process as well as the research process. And I cannot emphasize enough how vital that is. So although these statements do their best, I think they do not capture everything that the technical staff with whom I've worked, at least, have been able to do. There are many words used to describe technical input and technical staff, and many different cultures. So I've worked both in the UK, in the United States, and in Southern Europe. And only in the UK is there a strong technical body within the research context that is employed by the institutions, often by universities, of course, but not only, to back up the research scientists. That's a culture almost unknown, particularly in Southern Europe. Mostly things are outsourced to individual small companies to deliver the technical support. And this is nowhere near as effective, nowhere near as committed, nowhere near as driving of the research agenda. So there's an important piece that's involved in the UK in a permanent establishment of technicians within a research institute. And that, I'm afraid, is under some threat for a variety of reasons, which I'll perhaps touch on later on. The importance of the technician base, of stable technician base, is vital. In the US, such people are on very short-term contracts, usually relying entirely on soft money earned as grants. It's a very risky profession, therefore, in that case, and very few people are engaged in it, except in government laboratories. So there's an important role, but it's really quite unrecognized. This shows you something that you probably have all experienced, particularly those of you who are laboratory technicians, that somehow this is a demeaning activity, a pretty low-level bottle washing activity that serves people who do all the work. Now, the truth is, the average research scientist is active for a very short time in a laboratory, probably a good thing, in my view, because they possibly get dangerous, and I know I now would be lethal. The recognition, though, of the real input is not there. And that is true historically as well. And indeed, since I'm old enough, but not quite as old as this picture, this shows you essentially a picture of the technical input to a research process being underground, unseen, unrecognized, slaves to the academic brilliance of those, particularly in 18th, 19th century, of the gentleman scientist, who thought great thoughts but didn't actually get their hands dirty. Now, I think it's probably still true that the number of scientists who get their hands dirty for a long period is very small before they move on. But all that means an unrecognized body of work being done by our technical support. And it's still true. It's still true. Here are a few illustrations of where you might see technical input today. It runs from the undergraduate laboratory through fieldwork, geological fieldwork particularly, but not only, which is probably one of the more risky activities undertaken by technical support people. Space, which Dallas is going to tell us something about. Formula One, the workshop facilities, and finally Glastonbury, which, as you might tell from my accent, is very close to where I was born, which, of course, were it not for the technical support there, simply wouldn't exist to be such an enormous success. And then you finally got sketched there on the right, DNA, of course, and such analyses. So all these things involve technical staff. Now, my first encounter with technical staff was when I was at the University of Exeter. But believe it or not, there were photographs when I was an undergraduate, but they were still done with flash powder. So this is unfortunately me, quite a long time ago, in the 60s, and with hair, of course. I began as an undergraduate in physics and then a PhD student in physics, molecular physics, studying processes in gases, very dilute gases, in which high vacuum mattered. And high vacuum in the 1960s was a real challenge, not simple. And I was using glass a lot. So one of the things I had to learn was glassblowing. This is a skill that hasn't deserted me, but I don't use very often these days. But I was taught how to do that by professional technicians in glassware who were just amazing. Because I was using very low temperatures, liquid helium, which again was unusual at the time, and doing that in glass was quite a trick. I needed very special facilities, and I wouldn't have been able to do that without a lot of technical support. But I also learned how to machine metals, how to compute, and at the time the only way to use a computer was with paper tape, so you can tell how long ago that was. And I learned, therefore, an enormous number of skills, all from the technical staff. My supervisor, who was a very revered gentleman, but quite old, mostly doing his PhD in the 20s, so he had no idea about many of these newfangled skills like computers. So I got all my support from the technical staff. When I finished my PhD, I went to Brown University and I encountered engineering for the first time, working in a division of engineering, working on the properties again of fluids, this time for an engineering purpose, including gases, liquids, molten metals, geothermal brines, which are used in geothermal energy sources. But I also then had to learn a whole bunch of other skills about metal machining it, and designing properly using mechanical engineering principles about which I knew absolutely nothing. So again, the support from technicians was absolutely vital. And that's when, for the first time, I thought we should be recognizing these people in the only way available to me at the time, which was to include their names on publications. And Roger Paul, who is here, was a technician who taught me everything I knew about the mechanical engineering principles that lay behind the experiments we were doing. The instrument here was embedded on a basement in the building, isolated from all vibrations, because what it is a very small quartz disc suspended by a very fine quartz fiber undergoing torsional oscillations. It was about 1 meter high, so it was a really good detector of vibrations anywhere. It was quite difficult to assemble and quite difficult to make. And one of the characteristics of my time of research was we were making the instruments ourselves. These days, so much can be bought. Indeed, this whole show is about what can be bought from other suppliers who are making these things professionally. But in my time, we had to make all the instruments ourselves. So a whole different set of skills were necessary for that. When I left Brown, I came back to chemical engineering at Imperial College. So I was a lecturer, first of all, and I succeeded in pretending to be a chemical engineer for 30 years, which is quite a trick. I even became the president of the Institution of Chemical Engineers, which is an even bigger trick. And nobody ever spotted what a underhand trick this was. So I continued then to develop my own research activity. And again, I needed all the facilities of Imperial College to make this work. At the time, they were all very carefully divided into different disciplines. Mechanical engineering workshops, electronics workshops. And this guy at the top, Bert Lucas, was my man to make everything for me. He was, I guess, about 55 when I began, so he's unfortunately now died, but I kept in touch with him long after he retired. And the group of people below in the white coats, these are the team he worked with. And one of the younger people in that was an apprentice, which was the way people were trained and still are trained in these areas. And he later on became my most valuable technical assistant. The electronics people here in the bottom, they were the ones who introduced me to computers. So when I began, there were no real computers. You couldn't do things very easily. No laboratory-based activity at all. Everything had to be done manually and by hand. So I'll show you some of that. So we were again interested in the properties of fluids, a whole variety of things, looking at the thermal conductivity of materials, how well they conduct heat. This is something that's been done incorrectly for about 100 years, and I was determined we should do it correctly. It involved some mechanical engineering, so the cells on the right here, up there, these things are about 1 centimeter in diameter and about 20 centimeters long. We had to suspend a platinum wire of 1 micron in diameter. Your hair is about 100 microns, so rather fine. Suspend a wire in the middle of that, and then put the whole thing into a pressure vessel that would go sometimes up to 7,000 atmospheres pressure, and also down to low temperatures and high temperatures. So quite a trick. And without the technical support, wouldn't have been possible. In particular, I just want to illustrate this rather simple Wheatstone bridge circuit, because at the time, this was how we measured resistance change with time in a few tenths of a second, which we couldn't do with a computer. So we were interested in the time at which the resistance got to certain points. We were using timers for this, electronic timers, but we couldn't capture the data on a computer. So we had to write down every single digit, every single time, and then enter them manually into the only computer we had. This took forever. And it was the genius of my colleagues in the electronics workshop that first of all enabled that to be done, and then enabled us to revolutionize it later into a computer captured system. So I was extremely fortunate to have the support of technicians at that point. And similarly, with the other experiments we were doing, and you might notice I have a theme here. This is a viscometer. In this case, the wire is like a guitar string immersed in a fluid. You pluck it, and how quickly the guitar string decays, its vibration decays, tells you something about the viscosity of the fluid. And we could do this at very high pressures indeed. And the point I want to make is that I was still recognizing all the technical stuff. Malcolm Dix here is one of the people who did all the electronics that made all this possible. Something I knew nothing about. I only knew what I wanted to be done, and he knew how to do it. And I think that's still true. I was able, with him, to develop instruments in other countries, US, Portugal, and Greece. And as a result, we spent a number of rather good holidays together in Greece water skiing. So I don't know whether that counts as recognition, but I was certainly pleased that he took his boat with him. And then we moved to, with the oil industry, working for BP at the time, to what had become an important issue for them, which is they knew very little about what's called the phase behavior of oil deep in the ground at about 300 degrees Celsius and maybe 300 or 400 atmospheres pressure. And that mattered to the exploitation of the new reservoirs that you find deep in the ground. So we were engaged to develop an instrument to measure the phase behavior of these materials, which was quite tricky because sometimes you get 2 or 3 liquid phases, as well as a gas phase and perhaps a solid phase. And again, the development of this instrument, which was huge, maybe it doesn't give it much impression here. I would say it was about 10 meters cube, full of oil, and very dangerous. So I was looking to a number of technical staff to help me, and here is Tony Meredith, who was the technician who I said was an apprentice in that earlier picture, 20 years before, now became the lead person for me, and I wanted to recognize his contribution. So eventually, somebody said to me, I was rather critical at the time of the management of my department. The head of the department had been head of the department for 13 years, and I thought that was enough. So I said so. So the rector said to me then, well, all right, if you think it's so easy to do this job, you do it. So I first became head of a department, and then, having not made a complete hash of that, became deputy rector, or what is now called provost. So basically operating Imperial College on a day-to-day basis. And we, in our infinite wisdom, persuaded by the government, chose to merge with 4 different medical schools simultaneously. And this was a real shock to Imperial College, which had been science and engineering, to discover the medical fraternity, who were a different kind of animal altogether. So my principal activity was to try and inculcate into them something about Imperial College's ethos, and that involved the technical skills they possessed in medicine, which were quite different, and bring them into Imperial College. So it was quite a challenge. At the same time, we were renewing many of the technical facilities of the college, and I also got involved in pay negotiations at that time, in particular about the framework which we now use for all staff in universities in the UK. So that was a challenging time, but after I'd done that for a while, somebody suggested I might become the Vice-Chancellor somewhere, and the University of Southampton were foolhardy enough to think that would be a good idea. So I went to Southampton. Now, the contrast in many ways between a university in London and one in a relatively small city, 250,000 people, is enormous. Quite a different feel among the staff of all kinds, much more social. If you work at Imperial College, you could be 100 miles away from anybody else you work with when you go home in the evening. Nobody can afford to live in South Kensington. So nobody does, and therefore they live a long way away from each other. So there's almost no social interaction. Whereas at Southampton, of course, everybody lived rather locally, everybody knew everybody very well, all staff were engaged. And it was therefore quite a difference for me to be visible to all staff and engage with them all, particularly, of course, with the staff who weren't academic, because I was taking on a role I didn't already know everybody involved. So there was a lot of what I would call management by walking about. I had, I suppose, the foresight to have a couple of PhD students, because this introduced me to the technical staff within Southampton, but actually they enabled me to see the university from the other end of the telescope. And it does not look the same when you're on the top as it does when you're further down in the system. You can think everything's fine looked at from the top, but actually down in the grassroots, it's often not the same. And some of the problems that arose, I only found out by talking to the technicians. So there's another role for the technical staff in that kind of activity. At this point, of course, I'm beginning to make myself unpopular, because when you run things, that tends to be what happens. But I made the classic error of becoming chair of the Employers Association for Universities just at the time when we were beginning negotiations about salaries and, most importantly, and still today, about pensions. And that's a rather difficult issue. So this may be doubly unpopular, of course. But at the same time, I was doing experiments, and here is something we did. This is about molten metal thermoconductivity. So sodium, for example, is a coolant for nuclear reactors and will be in the future, trying to measure its properties for the design of such reactors. And again, in a big European project, there are technicians recognized here in the papers we published. Very important to do that, I believe. But then I made myself even more unpopular. I started to get involved at a national level in doing things for the government. So first of all, I was asked to do a review of physics in the UK as a subject, and I upset Brian Cox in the process because he believed I was about to undermine all the astronomy and particle physics that he so much loved. So the physicists began to dislike me. And then I was asked to do a review of the whole of the infrastructure and costing of research. And that upset all my Vice-Chancellor colleagues, because I told them they should cut down on the research costs. Now, very importantly in that, I knew from my own experience as a Vice-Chancellor and an academic that my academic colleagues like their own toys. So let's just focus on NMR machines, for example. Everybody wants their own. They want it in their laboratory, they want it under their control, and they don't want anybody else to use it. This means most of the time these machines are idle. And I set out to prove that, rather easily done. You just have to walk around and see the room with the lights off. And then I recommended that the research councils look at everybody who was asking for such machines and make sure there wasn't one already just been placed in that university or in a university just down the road, because we were duplicating facilities all over the place. So, of course, this upset a whole new group of people. And then because I was already unpopular, I had no friends to lose. So the coalition government asked me to look at the employability of graduates in science, engineering and mathematics. And actually it's not a good story. In engineering it's not so bad, but in science, in some areas there are real problems. One of them is computer science, where nearly 20% of computer science graduates are unemployed 6 months after they've graduated, despite a demonstrable huge demand for such people. How can that be? Why? And another group of people, perhaps slightly more relevant here, would be biology graduates, graduates in biological sciences. 40% of those graduates have not got a graduate job 6 months after they've graduated. Why is that? In the first case about computer science, it's about what's being taught in the universities. So the universities are responsible, I think, for that. And in the second case, arguably, it's about the school system that allows people to choose biological sciences and thus avoid mathematics. And if you avoid mathematics, then actually, in the modern world, you have a problem. There is no real role without some understanding of at least statistics, not necessarily all mathematics. So this conclusion actually was rather important, and that's where I interacted with the Science Council, because I gave them a job to do to fix that problem. And we're still thinking about what the best way is to fix those problems. Some of it to do with the universities, some to do with employers, but not all. Some to do with the professional bodies. So we're still working on that. So I've tried, in what I've done my own career, to recognize our technician colleagues and what they have done for science generally. Without them, most of my career would not have been successful, and I think that's true of many people. But the recognition of that is not there. You will not see on many scientific papers the names of technicians. It's not that they are so all-fired enthused by being on a paper, their name in lights. It is rather a statement of how much you recognize them. And this is vital. And the problem is we have allowed the system to neglect the training of such people, and we have allowed the job to be not as attractive in universities or elsewhere as it ought to be. And part of that is about recognition. So I'm passionate about trying to rectify that. And you'll see here that the Gatsby Foundation estimate we need 70,000 more technical staff. Because, of course, people of my generation and slightly afterwards are all now retiring. And that's taking a large fraction of this workforce away, which we need to replace. And the reason we have preeminent science in the UK is exactly that we need more technical staff. Other people are beginning to recognise this. The Royal Society, the Funding Council for England are beginning to think they do understand technicians are needed. So something is happening, but we need to do more. And that's where the Science Council comes in and its technician commitment. I don't intend to say very much about this other than to illustrate the 5 principles here they're trying to support, and then to show you a short video of people speaking from my position and other positions, some of whom, of course, I know, about their passion for technician commitment. So let me go to that.
The Technician Commitment is a collaborative sector-wide initiative to elevate the status and profile of technicians working across higher education and research. Universities and research institutes are invited to become signatories of the commitment, and by doing so they're signifying their support to ensuring visibility, recognition, career development and sustainability for the technical community.
I'm really pleased that we, the University of Nottingham, are founding signatory of the Technicians Commitment. It's just impossible to think that we could deliver everything we deliver in education and student experience, what we deliver in research and knowledge exchange, without the commitment of talented, capable, well-trained technicians.
So I'm delighted that King's College London is one of the founding signatories of the Technician Commitment.
This new technician commitment is really important to us, and I'm delighted that Loughborough is one of the founding signatories.
At VTI we know that every researcher and every technician counts. Technicians are our unsung heroes. They're our glue that holds our universities and our research together.
When I graduated from university, I moved straight into a technician role, which involved contributing to scientific papers.
When they have problems with different parts, they can come and get advice from me, and I'll try and pass on my years of knowledge and expertise.
I think the reason why we need to be more recognised is so that people do understand. Technicians tend to silently get on and make it all happen, and people don't understand what it is they're actually doing, so to have that visible recognition really helps.
I think the things with technicians is they are specialists in their field, and therefore they can offer a really high level of advice and encouragement to students working within those disciplines.
I definitely do think it's important to attract younger people into technical careers because it's a very fulfilling career. It's a very good career path for personal development as well as technical development.
The trainee technicians are important because we need to have somebody coming in to fill the gaps for those who are likely to leave in the next few years. The skills need to be passed on, or we risk losing the institutional memory.
So at the minute we've got about 4 apprentices in the workshop. My apprentice in that 4 years, I've gained a great deal of experience on engineering.
I've been a technician now for 6 months, but I'm already in the process of becoming professionally registered.
Technicians' commitment, I think, we're really important for the standing, the sustainability of our workforce, and I do wish it well.
The commitment's a great way of us all acknowledging the great work that technicians do. In higher education there's a fantastic amount that's done by technicians, and the commitment is a way of us acknowledging that.
All of the Midlands Innovation Universities have collectively pledged their support to this important commitment.
I trained as a doctor and I'd been working as a junior doctor, and when I started in the lab I knew nothing. I was a complete klutz, and the people who taught me which way was up and how to do the basics were the technical staff, and they were terrific, and for that I'm eternally grateful.
Good. Robert Leckler, who spoke there, was at Imperial College, so I know he's not a klutz, but if he actually learnt from the technical staff and says so, then he's to be believed, and he's a very good research scientist. So this is at the beginning, this commitment by many organisations, and I want to just run through the sorts of people who are committing to this initiative. And things are beginning, but there's a long way to go. I particularly like this one about WISE because it means there's a new initiative in something that's already an important element, which is to get more women into science and engineering. Now a technician strand has been added to the academic strand. So the real recognition is there, very important. So I want to urge all of you who are technicians to be taking pride in what you do. It's vital to the science base of the UK. Without you, it's just not going to be the same, and without redeveloping the material, the raw material of technical training, we must. Without that, we're going to be lost. So it's vital that we do it, and it's vital that we recognise it. And you've seen some illustrations that it's beginning. So thanks very much for your attention. It's been a pleasure to be with you.